The scripture given to us today comes from Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 22. You turn to your handout and let's all read it together in one voice. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him, along with Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. The word of the Lord for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Have you heard of the saying, "An enemy of my enemy is my friend," right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Oh, how they hated Jesus. I mean, they hated Jesus so much the Pharisees would actually get in this conspiracy, partnering with people groups that they would never normally partner with. So in order to get Jesus, we see in other parts of the scriptures how they plotted along with the Sadducees. Pharisees and Sadducees, they're like rivals. They will never get along with one another. And here, they said they actually sent their disciples. The Pharisees sent their disciples to Jesus along with Herodians. And then they asked Jesus this question: is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, taxes are a pretty sensitive subject in this country. There's a statistic that says, whatever you earn from January 1 to like May 31st, it goes towards government, right? Whether you're paying in terms of sales tax or income tax and all those kind of Social Security and all those kind of things. There's a saying that there's only two certain things in life, which are death and taxes, right? In fact, United States is a country that's founded because of a tax issue. The Stamp Act, which put a tax on the teas and those kind of imports from Great Britain to the American colonies, and it kind of, the bunch of drunkards in Boston decided that, hey, they're gonna go mess with this ship that brought in the tea, and they just threw it to the Boston Harbor, beginning the Boston Tea Party. Right? And then the phrase is such as "no taxation without representation." So from there we see like the people who are supposedly for the colony, the so-called patriots, right? Versus, I'm sure at the time there were many people who were actually for Great Britain and they wanted to stay with Great Britain, and so on and so forth. Perhaps those people who wanted to stay with Great Britain in the American history are much like Herodians in our story today. Because Herodians get their name Herodian because they are for Herod. Herod Antipas at that particular time, who has been made king over the Palestine region by none other than the Roman Caesar. So these are the people who will be for paying taxes to the Caesar. But the Pharisees, on the other hand, are actually the opposite. They say, hey, we are all about God's law. And we are very strict. We interpret God's law literally, and we are very strict about how we're going to keep God's law. They wanted to make sure that they're keeping God's law so perfectly. They don't want to even accidentally, make a mistake and disobey the law. So what they would often do is they would build these hedges, right? So that they're not crossing over the line. For example, on Sabbath day, on the Jewish Sabbath, the farthest that you could actually travel is 2,000 cubits, which is approximately 0.6 miles. So if you go, it's actually 0.592 or something like that. So if you actually go over that, you've broken the Sabbath. So what they would do is they would actually just draw a line at 0.5, so they're safe from crossing over. They're very, very strict in terms of the law. And because of that, they actually are against paying taxes to the Caesar. Because as we've read in the story, how do you pay taxes? You use a coin, right? The coin is denarius. And Jesus asks, whose inscription, whose image is on it? And there's the image of Caesar. During this particular time, it was Caesar Tiberius. And there's an inscription that says the Caesar, the son, and the divine of Caesar Augustus. Tiberius is a son of Augustus, and it says he's divine, he's God, he's a son of God, and so on and so forth. So to actually carry denarius in their pocket is actually going against first commandment, which says, you shall have no other gods before me. And Caesar claims himself to be God. And then the second commandment, you shall not make any idols. And there's an image, icon of Caesar on that coin. So these two should be like oil and water. They cannot mix. They should not mix. They shouldn't get along with one another. And yet, out of their selfish heart, out of the dark desires of their heart, they actually compromise their principles and they get along. They go in hand to trap Jesus. Now, how they do it is pretty interesting because they come to Jesus and they say these things about Jesus. And to be honest, I don't think they're really sincere. They're just trying to set Jesus up, right? But what they say without sincerity is actually the truth about Jesus, because this is what they say about Jesus. Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. This is not them making the sincere confession before God. They perhaps didn't believe any of these things about Jesus. But as they're saying it, out of the insincerity of their hearts, they're actually proclaiming the truth about Jesus. And not only are they proclaiming truth about Jesus, they're actually saying we are not these things. You're truthful, we are not truthful. You are sincere, we are not sincere. You don't care about anyone's opinions and you are not swayed by appearances, but we are. Right? So even as they're making unknowingly, perhaps, the confessions of their hearts, they're setting Jesus and they throw this particular question: is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And I'm sure many of you have grown up in the church and you've heard this message before, so you know why this is a setup question. If Jesus says, don't pay taxes to Caesar, then he'll be known as seditionist, which is like he's playing to the crowd. He's trying to lead a revolution. He's trying to raise up an insurrection against the Roman Empire. But if he were to say, yes, pay taxes to Caesar, then perhaps he's going to be accepted by the Roman government and the Herodians, but he's going to lose many of the people who hated Rome. Right? He's going to lose his popularity and so on and so forth. And he could be labeled as not faithful before God. But of course we know that Jesus actually transcends above this matter. And he says, why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Bring me a coin. How do you pay tax? Bring me that coin. They bring him a denarius. Whose image is on it? Whose inscription is on it? They say Caesar's. And he says, then pay or render to Caesar what is Caesar's. But he doesn't just end there. He says, render to God what is God's. And the scripture said they went away, marveled at his answer. But the real question for us is this. Why does this matter to us today? This particular story about rendering to Caesar what is Caesar, rendering to God what is God, why does that matter to us? Well, for many commentators, I was preparing for this message. I was reading through probably about 4 or 5 different commentators about this particular passage. And pretty much all of them says, well, this passage matters because we have a double duty as Christians. We have our duty to God, and we have our duty to our country or our government, those who are ruling over us. I mean, and they often go to Romans. I believe it's Romans chapter 13, where Paul talks about, hey, every government, every power is given by God, is sanctioned by God. Therefore, you need to obey the civil matters, and so on and so forth. So in order for us to be a good Christian, in order for us to be faithful followers of Jesus, not only do you have to do your duty to God, but you also have to be an exemplary citizen. And I don't necessarily deny that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. That we need to obey, right, the laws of this land. That is why I often say, myself included, many of my friends, when they see some people drive around with the Ichthus fish on their car, they cringe. Because they're claiming, hey, I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus, and then they're breaking every single traffic law out there, right? They cringe. So we need to follow the rules and regulations of this land, and we need to live righteously before God. But the problem is, not that I don't agree with those sentiments, but the problem is how it actually gets played out in our practice. Right? What I mean by that is this. And in order for us to understand that, we really need to understand what Jesus means. He says, render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So what belongs to Caesar? What belongs to Caesar is this thing, this coin that has Caesar's image and Caesar's inscription on it, right? This coin called denarius, it has Caesar on it. So since Caesar's image is on it, that belongs to Caesar. The whole economic system at the time belongs to Caesar. But Jesus says, don't just render things that belongs to Caesar, but render to God what is God's. So what is God? What belongs to God? Right? And if we just kind of think about it for a moment, the coin is Caesar's because it has Caesar's image on it. Therefore, by same logic, things that are God's must have God's image on it. So what has God's image? What has God's inscription? What has the fingerprints of God? Right? First and foremost, it's us. We have God's image, human beings, because when God created the world, as He was creating Adam and Eve, He created us in the image of God. And what has God's inscription? Where has God left His mark? Well, if you think about it, it's everything, isn't it? Is there anything in this world that came without God's approval? God created everything in the universe. Whether it's a known universe that we often think about, and the more and more you study about universe, it's this fascinating concept because it's something that we cannot actually understand. Right? So only thing that we explain is that, hey, this is the known universe. These are the things that we know about universe, but there's other parts of the universe where we don't know. But all of that God has created. Right? All of that God has created. So I believe when Jesus says, render to God what is God's, he is basically saying, you need to give yourself to God, and you need to use everything in this world to bring God the glory. Well, from there, let's go a step further then. When Jesus said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, right? But who does Caesar belong to? Even Caesar belongs to God, right? I'm not saying that Caesar had a personal relationship with God. No, Caesar is a human being. Caesar was created by God. Now, what that means is, when Jesus says, render to Caesar what is Caesar, I believe he's saying that even as you render things to Caesar, you're supposed to do it as a service or as an offering unto the Lord. Now, the problem with it is, I believe, we often distinguish those things. We often separate those things. And says, hey, this is my duty to my country, and this is my duty to God. Right? This God, my duty to God, my religious life is a personal life. It's just between me and my God. Right? And then what I do in my public life, as I live out my life as a faithful citizen of this country, right? Those things, oftentimes, where it plays out, have nothing to do with one another. We separate it out. I mean, we often hear, like when the politician is asked, hey, I know you're a faithful Catholic. I know you're a faithful Christian. Like, will your Christian belief sway in the way that you're going to vote? And they say, I've heard many politicians say, like my religious life is my personal life. I'm not going to let those things impact my public life. But like if you think about it, that makes no sense whatsoever. Right? It's often the same thing. Hey, my religious life is it's just one thing. It's my private life between me and God. But my work, that's my duty to my company. I'm not going to let this religion, my private religion, impact the way that I will serve my work. Whether we like to admit it or not, functionally, that's how we act a lot of different times. But what Jesus is saying is, no, actually think about what belongs to God. If everything belongs to God, then everything must be rendered to God. Right? Whether it's your work, your business, your school, your family, your relationship with one another, your HOAs, your private clubs and organizations that you belong to. They're not just something that you do separate away from your relationship with God. Your relationship with God must actually impact the way in which you serve in those areas. You cannot separate those things from your relationship with God. And we often do that. We often do that, and also on top of that, God says, I think I've done enough. We give certain portions, right? And says, I think I've done enough. I remember several years back, right? There was a Republican presidential candidate named Herman Cain, right? This long time ago, probably over like a dozen years ago. And he said, He was famous for his plan for 999 tax. Right? Speaking of taxes, the 999 tax is that you pay federal government 9%, you pay the state government 9%, you pay a flat sales tax of 9%, right? 999, that's it. No other taxes, right? And his famous thing was, hey, if 10% was good enough for God, then 9% should be good enough for the government, right? And oftentimes we give our tithe to God. And we says, hey, I've done enough for my God. Or maybe you go a little bit beyond that and says, I've done more than enough for my God. But did God ask for our tithe? Did God ask for our money? Did God ask for just monetary things? No, when Jesus says render to God what is God's, he's asking for you. Not your money, not your possessions. He's asking for you. Right? Yeah, I might have shared this with you before. I cannot remember which pastor said this. But I remember hearing in a sermon that this pastor says, hey, do you know why there isn't a call for tithe in the New Testament? Old Testament, there's a lot of passages about giving tithe. Right? And I said, hey, tithing is you're acknowledging God, that He is our King. But in the New Testament, there may be just even one hint of tithe, but it is pretty silent about tithe. And the reason is, this passage says, because in the New Testament ethics, you're supposed to give all to God. Not just your 10%, not just your 10% of your money, not just your 10% of your time. Everything must be rendered unto God, because everything belongs to God. It is as Paul says it in Romans chapter 12. It says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, I preached on that passage many, many times before, and I want to just ask you guys a question, whether you remember it or not. There's an important word in there. To really understand what that passage is talking about, there's a super, super important word. You guys remember what that word is? Right? That word is therefore. Right? Therefore. So what he's saying is, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, which is a spiritual worship, right? But the reason that you do that is therefore, right? It's because everything that comes between chapter 1 and chapter 11 of Romans, therefore, you offer yourself. The reason the chapter 1 and chapter 11 is all about God's grace, how God has rescued us, how God has devoted himself to all of us. See, God demands all of you. Jesus says, render yourself, render everything to God, because all of you belongs to God, because he bought you at a price. Dear friends, we got to understand that. Well, actually, let me read you this one particular passage. I find this fascinating because it's talking about image. Right? God's image in you. Right? But in a little different way. Isaiah chapter 49, verses 15 through 16. Listen to these words. Can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb? Right? As she is breastfeeding a child, do you think any mother, right? Any normal mother will be like, where's my child? Or what am I doing? No, she will never forget her nursing child, right? But some do, actually. That's the reality of this world, right? Even these may forget. This is what God said. Yet I will never forget you. Behold, I have engraved you on the palm of my hands. Your walls are continually before me. You see that? I have engraved you in the palm of my hand. That's God saying to you. The coin belongs to Caesar because on this coin is the image, engraved image of Caesar. We belong to God because on us there's God's image engraved. And you know what God is saying? God is saying, I have engraved you. And what God does in a fascinating reversal is that as He is asking you to render yourself unto Him, as He's asking you to give all of yourself to Him, what He's saying is that since I have you engraved on my hand, I'm giving all of myself to you. And He did on the cross. Every last drop of His blood, every last drop of the fluid out of His body, the life, the source of life, died on the cross because He gave Himself for us. Therefore, dear friends, therefore, render to God what is God's. Give yourself unto Him. Not just partially, not just some aspect of your life, but all of it. Because that is a right worship before God. Amen.